Welcome. Today I would like to talk to you about a game from a match between our team Aachener SV and Neuberg. And our team Aachener SV managed to win with a score of 5-3. I played against Nikolas Lubbe. You might know him and his wife Melanie because they also promote chess quite a bit. And among others, I think they also have their own chess school. I started the game with my pet move knight f3, and I was expecting him to go for a queen's gambit declined now with the move d7 to d5. Instead, he played the move bishop to b4. And here I went for the move queen c2 again, which I had played in some of the previous games. I also had played g3 in the past, but not being prepared, I thought queen c2, which is a very solid line, makes a lot of sense. So he doesn't choose one of the most common continuations here, but instead he goes for the move d5. And what he had planned actually was to transpose back to a sort of queen's gambit declined, which he now did after a3, bishop e7 and d4. So now we have a typical queen's gambit declined structure, but I played the move queen c2 and a3 on move 5, instead of in this position where white usually just plays the move bishop to f4. So I basically replaced two moves by one move, but the two moves maybe are not as strong as the one move bishop to f4. Still, I felt that this should at least not be detrimental to my position. He continued with knight bd7, and white has different options here. White can, for instance, take on d5 or go for something like e3. But in the game, I decided I would go for e4. Main idea being to potentially transpose to some type of a Catalan structure if he exchanges, and later on I can get g3 and bishop g2 in. But this should also not materialize because he basically played quite forcing. He took twice and now just went for c5, directly attacking my center and aiming for knight to f6 next. I protected the pawn, quite logical. And now he gave a check, again quite forcing, and went for the move queen to b6, hitting d4 and b2. After some thought here, I decided that the most natural move is probably bishop to c3, protecting both pawns. But then I saw this funny move b4, which I thought looks much more entertaining, and that's why I decided to go for that. So if he takes on b4, I can just go c5, and then I win back the pawn on b4. So he didn't do that, but instead he went for the move knight to f6 first. And I was also expecting that kind of, and just played queen to c2, which is now a proper pawn sacrifice. So if I want to keep the pawn on d4, I can play queen f4, but I went for queen c2, temporarily sacrificing this d4 pawn. He took, and I kicked away his queen. And now if he goes to d8, okay, then it's a temporary pawn sacrifice, but I will probably win it back. But instead he went for queen c7, allowing me to take on d4. I think even here, maybe the best continuation would just have been to play bishop to d3, and then continue with castles, rook e1, and put some pressure if he plays e5 on the e5 pawn, or otherwise at some point reclaim the d4 pawn. But during the game, I thought, okay, I can just take on d4, and it's going to be actually quite fine, but probably this is a small mistake. So I took on d4, he gave a logical check on e5, and I played bishop to e3. And here the computer actually says that black is already better by just castling, and then in the next move going for something like knight d5 and a5. And it turns out that I'm quite unstable here, and I'm not fully in time to play bishop e2 castles, queen d2 and consolidate, but he's already challenging my structure on the queen side, and so probably that would have been slightly better for black. Instead, he played what I also had expected, namely the move knight d5 straight away, hitting my bishop on e3. The disadvantage of playing knight d5 straight away is that I can play now bishop to b5 check, and his king is slightly worse than in the other lines. So he has to go to f8. And now, while I'm losing my pair of bishops, at least I'm already quite far ahead in development, and his king is stuck on f8 and his bishop is stuck on c8. So I thought actually that here I'm quite substantially better. So after takes, I didn't go for queen e3, which I thought might be small advantage, but I thought after f takes e, I have a substantial advantage. And after the game, we briefly talked, and my opponent told me that he also thought he was quite substantially better here. And I mean, I can see his point, because he has the pair of bishops, and my pawn structure here is slightly damaged. But on the other hand, his king and his bishop are pretty weak, so I think that probably my judgment was closer to the truth. Maybe I'm not as much better as I thought, but probably white is somewhat better here. He went for the check, further disrupting my pawn structure and especially my king safety on the king side. And going back bishop f6. And of course, in the long run, black has a lot of trumps here. If black gets activated, has the pair of bishops. Now my king is weak, so especially like the light squares around the king are very weak. So this gives him a lot of like long-term trumps, whereas my trumps are more like the development which I have at this point. And also that for the moment at least, it might be a little bit easier to play for white. So I castled. And he's kind of stuck. So on the other hand, I also don't have a very direct plan of hitting him. So he played h5, potentially aiming at h4 and maybe also creating luft for the king or a route for the rook. So I think h5 is a pretty good move. I centralized my rook. And now he started challenging the queen side. So went for a6, kicking away the bishop, and then for a5. And in this position, I think I had a chance to get a substantial advantage by playing the move knight to f3. I had seen this move in advance, and I had calculated the following line. Queen to c7, and now queen b5, threatening checkmate. And I thought he can go g5, and maybe now something like that. But it turns out that this is actually too slow. So I can directly go knight d2, which I missed in the calculation, and then kick away his knight later on with knight to e4. And he's substantially too slow to finish development, and white would be winning in this position. So instead, probably after queen b5, he would have to settle for something like queen e7, but then he's just extremely passive. Thus, I missed this nice opportunity of playing knight f3, but instead went for the caveman approach, direct queen b5, threatening queen e8 checkmate. Now, in contrast to the other line, he can actually go g5, and yeah, it's not so easy to attack his king. I was thinking about just sacking the rook, takes, and going for something like rook f1, and maybe c6. In this position, I felt it's very, very hard to evaluate and to understand. And interestingly, the computer agrees and also thinks it's pretty unclear. So instead of doing that, I went for the move knight to f3, which is probably a big mistake, allowing him now to take on e3. Yeah, so note that if he goes back queen c7, we transpose to the previously mentioned line. But here he has a much stronger option of playing queen to e3, which during the game I thought was pretty risky, but tactically it works out for black. So kudos to him for going for these complications. King h1. And now he just went for the move king to g7, protecting his bishop on f6. And I had foreseen that, and I thought that in the following line after rook de1, I actually have very good attacking chances. He took. I basically now sacrifice everything. Knight e5. Also sacking the pawn on b4, so sacking a third pawn in a row. But what I had missed in the calculation when I played knight to f3 was that in this position I don't have the move bishop to rook to f6, because he can take here. It's a check. And even if I go back, he can just take on e5, and my attack has evaporated. So for that reason, after sacking 3 pawns, I was now actually forced to play in a different way, namely to just go back with the queen to e2. It's still pretty, still feels like a pretty dangerous attack, because if he takes on a4, so he is now up a piece and 3 pawns. But here, after like rook f6, it felt extremely dangerous to me. So if he takes back, I can enter with the queen, and it feels like he's getting mated. So for that reason, he didn't go queen a4, but just consolidated his position with the move rook to h6, protecting the bishop on f6. Yeah, so here maybe you can pause the video and you can try to find a good move for white. well, we were both already in pretty big time trouble at this point, and I had previously anticipated that I would play bishop to e8, hitting f7, and that would have been a decent move. So that would have been one option, and probably the coolest move in the position would have been the move h4. And if he takes on a4, just to take here and to take on f7 with a huge attack for white. In any case, objectively, black is still clearly better. Instead, in the game, I played basically another blunder, which looks like a very nice move at first glance, namely the move knight takes f7. The point is, if he takes back, then after rook f6, he can probably not take back with the king due to queen e5. And if he takes back with the rook, then I have queen h5 with a huge attack and probably at least a perpetual. However, the problem is that he's not really forced to take back on f7. And that's what I missed in the game as well. He just took on a4 instead, which was a big problem for me. Yeah, because now I'm down a ton of material. I think it's 2 pawns and a piece. And yeah, the only way to regain that material is to take on h6, but now this knight is kind of out of game. And the bigger problem even is that he has this queen c6 check hitting this diagonal, and I can't go here because of bishop d4, and I can basically resign. So after queen c6, I'm forced to go queen to g2, and not to run to this bishop d4 check. And while he cannot take on h6 immediately because I have rook f6, in the long run he will be able to recuperate this knight on h6, and then I'm just lost. Fortunately, there were still 9 moves left to the time control, so there was also room for my opponent to make some errors. He played bishop d7, very strong move, developing another piece. Yeah, and here I now realize that it's a good idea to create some luft for the king, because if the bishops land on these diagonals, the king needs a safe haven, and the only square would be h2. So that's why I went h4 now in this position. A little bit too late. As I said earlier, it would have been clearly stronger. Probably here he could have gone g4 as well, but okay, he took on h4, which also is just clearly better for black. But at least gave me the chance to go for this rook f3, finally cutting this diagonal, and having the idea that in the far distant future, maybe I can start attacking his king if he takes on h6. He went for h3, reopening the pin. But now, after queen f2, he can take on h6. Maybe it's would have been even stronger to play rook h8 here to take it back with the rook. But okay, he took on h6, and now at least I can get rook h2 in. And I'm still down, I guess, 3 pawns and a rook against 2 bishops. But his king looks a little bit more vulnerable now. I thought with objectively best play, I'm probably lost, but maybe there are some swindling chances in the time control. He played bishop to g7. And here I think I found a very, very nice swindling resource. I was first calculating moves like rook f6, but he can just go king h7, and there's not much attack following. So in the end, I found this very nice move, rook to d1, with the threat of going maybe rook d6 next. And if he plays something like bishop e8, at least then I hit the pawn on e6, and this looked quite dangerous. Still, objectively, what he should have done here is to just go bishop to e8 and meet rook d6. The problem is rook d6 does not really work at this point because of queen e4, and whenever I kick the queen away, he has queen g2 exchanging queens and is just completely lost for me. So probably I would have had to settle for something like check and then rook d6. But yeah, objectively this should not be enough. Black should be able to consolidate, play bishop to g6 at some point, and eventually win the game. However, this is obviously also not very easy to see for him during the time control, and he played a move which also seems logical, bringing his king to a safer square on h7, but which now objectively loses his advantage. Because now the point is after bishop to d6, rook to d6, he has to keep protection of the bishop, and for that reason can no longer keep this diagonal intact. and then I get my f rook free to move. So he went for queen to b5, and I went for rook to f7. It's pretty much forcing now. He goes here. And yeah, if I play something like rook e7, he can probably just consolidate with bishop to g6, followed by rook to g8. So I didn't want to do that. And instead, I went for the most forcing line. Rook takes g7, king takes g7. And after rook takes e6, we finally reached the time control. And to be honest, when I got up from my chair, I was completely uncertain whether I'm winning, whether I'm lost, or whether it's going to be a draw. And I think it was the same for my opponent. I mean, obviously, I'm still down a full bishop and 2 pawns, but it also looks extremely dangerous for him with his king here on g7. Yeah, because his rook is not yet in the game, and yeah, it's very hard also for him to continue from here. All his pieces are kind of dislocated. So he went for the most logical move, queen to d7, bringing the most valuable piece to the defense. And yeah, here I spent basically most of my remaining thinking time trying to figure out what the best way of attacking is. And I basically calculated 3 different options. One was queen to f6, one was queen to f5, and the other one was queen to e3. So if you want, you can pause the video and you can also make up your mind what you think is the best move. If I go queen to e3, this looks like a big threat, but it turns out that after queen d5, he actually protects the 5th rank. And so if I give a check, there's not really anything following up, and he threatens checkmate. So queen to e3 was relatively easy to rule out. Next, I calculated queen f5. The point here is that, okay, I'm threatening rook g6 check. He can't take back because his queen is hanging. But unfortunately, he has this check first, Zwischenschach, king takes, and now just bishop to f7. And I'm running out of ways of attacking him because, again, these 2 pieces nicely protect the 5th rank. And if I give, for instance, a check or something like that, then in the end, my attack runs out of steam. So for that reason, I in the end settled with the best move in the position, the move queen to f6 check, which looks probably also the most logical and is probably also the most the game move which I would have played in a blitz game. King g8 is forced, and now I go rook e7, threatening checkmate and threatening to take his queen. So when I was calculating queen f6, I was mainly calculating 2 moves here, queen to g4 and queen to d2. And I was most afraid of queen to d2 check, takes, and bishop to d7 check. The point of this is that the short style maneuver king to h4 does not work in this case. Why? Well, it's check, check, and here he has this weird rook to a6, which suddenly completely cripples my attack. And note that rook g7 is met by queen g7, checkmate. Oh, almost checkmate I can take here, but I'm losing everything. So that is not possible. However, after bishop d7, I actually have this very nice move g4, and suddenly black has to be very careful not to be lost. Yeah, because, for instance, after hg, king g3, queen d3, this was the line which I calculated, king h4, now he runs out of checks because the queen is misplaced here, and if he has to exchange the queen for the rook, I will also win the bishop on d7, and white is just winning. So the computer still finds a way to save the game after g4 by playing bishop takes g4 and then here h4, and shows that this is a perpetual with most clever play, but it's definitely not something you want to calculate as black, because it's obvious that you can either be losing or it's, in the very best case scenario, a draw. So for that reason, after thinking for quite some time, my opponent decided not to go queen d2 check, which would have been extremely risky, but he went for the move queen to g4 instead, which is much, much stronger. I'm basically forced to go back to e5 to continue the attack, threatening rook g5, which would win the queen. And yeah, now he can go back queen d7 and we would just repeat moves. Or he repeated moves in a different way. He went for the move king to h7, now intending to meet rook g5 with queen e2. And the point here is that here after the check, it's now a checkmate on h2. So I can't do that. So I thought I was forced to go back to e7. He went back here, this, king h7, and we repeated moves. So after the game, Thomas Koch from my team came and he told me, okay, you could still try this move, queen f8, why don't you do that? And yeah, this move is funny, looks very interesting, but it's also very, very risky. So the point is, I still have this e2 squared covered, so you can't play queen e2 check in this line. But he can do different things. For instance, he can go king g6, and after rook e7, he can go queen d4, and the position is still absolutely unclear. Queen g8 check, king f5, for instance, and the game just continues with the same madness as before. Or after queen f8, he could also go for the move queen to g7, which then might lead to some position like this, which according to the computer is also still a draw. Well, it's not really a missed chance in the end, so instead after king h7 I repeated moves with rook e7 check and rook e5, and we agreed to a draw. Well, what can I say? It was a very exciting game, obviously. I missed a very good chance to play this knight f3 and queen b5, which would have probably given me a huge advantage. But afterwards, I was extremely lucky to escape from a deadly lost position after this knight takes f7 and queen takes a4, where I think I was saved by this very nice idea of playing rook d1 in time trouble, which I think he had missed. And yeah, then in the end, I think it was a matter of luck whether I win, lose, or draw this game. So overall, if I consider the entire weekend, probably 1 point out of these 2 games was kind of deserved. Well, that's it from me today, and see you next time.